What's up, everyone? Tara Roberts here with your free agency deep cuts for week 16. Before we get started, be sure to like this video and subscribe to Fantasy Alarm. Now, at quarterback this week, we are going to go with Tyler Huntley. This one is very simple. Lamar Jackson is out, and Huntley has been fantastic and aligns perfectly with what we love the most in our fantasy football quarterbacks: rushing upside. Cincinnati isn't exactly an easy matchup, but he is still in a QB1 range. Last week, Huntley completed 28 of 40 attempts for 215 yards, 2 touchdowns, and added 13 carries, 473 yards, and 2 more touchdowns on the ground. He is a fantastic streaming option. At running back, the pickings are slim because unfortunately the best streaming options were snatched up earlier in the week. But if you couldn't get yourself a Ronald Jones or a Justin Jackson, it's not the worst option in the world to pivot to Duke Johnson. It's risky because he will be splitting carries with Myles Gaskin, and the matchup against New Orleans is pretty much the worst that you can get for running backs. But Johnson is coming off a fantastic game, and that level of production is going to earn him a role in the Dolphins' offense. Johnson had 22 carries for 107 yards, and while he only had 1 reception for 20 yards, he has been a very capable pass-catching back in the past if the Dolphins opt to avoid heavy work on the ground. Craig Reynolds is another option. Jamal Williams is coming off the COVID list and will play. DeAndre Swift is still questionable. And if Swift can't go, I'm still comfortable with going with Reynolds. Basically, the matchup is fantastic. Atlanta is 26th in DVOA against the run, and while I do love Jamal Williams, the highest number of carries he's had all season was 17 in week 13, and it's been 3 weeks since he has been on the field. Reynolds saw 26 carries last week. Williams returning to the lead back role with Swift out does make sense, but Atlanta is a team that Detroit can lean heavy against with the run, meaning that both Williams and Reynolds can be viable fantasy options this week. Moving on to wide receivers, Marquez Valdes-Scantling is out with COVID, and that means that the wide receiver 2 role falls right into the lap of Allen Lazard. Lazard has the edge in snap count over MVS and has over the past few weeks, but targets and yardage have tilted more towards MVS. And that is important because over the past 5 weeks, Aaron Rodgers has the highest average fantasy points for quarterbacks. The Packers are pushing heavy volume through the air, and it's working, so I don't expect things to slow down. Lazard is very low rostered and a viable fantasy asset this week. Another player bumped up due to injuries is Tyler Johnson. Chris Godwin is down for the year. Mike Evans is out for this week. Johnson caught 4 of his 7 targets last week for 41 yards. Antonio Brown is coming back and will lead the way, I'm sure. Gronk will certainly have a big role as well. But Johnson has the opportunity to serve as the third option in what is typically a very strong pass-heavy offense. And if you're looking for a guy who doesn't necessarily have high upside but has a pretty stable floor, you can go with Laquan Treadwell. Treadwell has averaged 10.9 fantasy points in PPR over the past 3 weeks. And there's no boom or bust nature with it. It is literally what you can expect every single week out of him. No more, no less. And oddly enough, that 10.9 fantasy points gives you the right to call yourself the wide receiver 1 in the Jags offense. And that does not mean much, but I'm just letting you know. In this crazy week, we just might need a guy who we know can get us a very specific floor, and Treadwell can be your guy for that very specific purpose. Another option is Josh Reynolds. The Lions are technically on a roll, winning 2 of their last 3 games. Jared Goff has scored the 9th most fantasy points for quarterbacks over that time period. Wild, but true. And Josh Reynolds has been wide receiver 19 in full PPR over that time period. Somehow, even wilder, but also true. Unfortunately, Jared Goff is out with COVID, and Tim Boyle will likely step in to start. So this definitely does put a little damper on things and is less than ideal. But given the fact that they face Atlanta, I'm still okay with pulling Reynolds off waivers if you really need to. And at tight end, we will go with Cole Kmet. I have zero faith that Kmet will get a touchdown this week. Although, Nick Foles is in line to get the start for Chicago. So maybe, just maybe, he has some flashbacks of Zach Ertz and defies Matt Nagy's game plan of fading Cole Kmet in the red zone. But even without the touchdown, the target share has been very good for Kmet, making him a viable option in PPR. He's had a total of 32 targets over the past 4 weeks and has a fantastic matchup against Seattle, who has been very poor defending tight ends. And that wraps things up for this week's free agency deep cuts. As always, be sure to like this video and subscribe to Fantasy Alarm, and come back next week for another round of deep cuts.